So this webinar, turnover rent clauses in retail leases, the latest trend or here to stay. No doubt it's been a significant 48 hours for British retail. However, even before the pandemic, retailers have been facing significant headwinds with rising costs and changes in customer habits. The pandemic has only served to accelerate the rebalancing between physical and digital retail and seen a surge in the rise of e-commerce. The result has been the loss of many big names from the high street, retailers such as Oasis and Warehouse moving to online only, the news of Arcadia Group's administration and closure of Debenhams, the latest cases in point. As a result, many commentators are suggesting that the pandemic will bring about a fundamental change in the landlord and tenant relationship in retail leases and the approach to rent setting. One of the solutions proposed is the wider use of turnover rents, where the whole or part of the rent payable by the tenant is calculated by reference to the gross turnover generated by the premises. In this webinar, I shall speak in three parts. Firstly, I'll provide an introduction, an overview of some of the market conditions in which the discussion around turnover rents is taking place. I'll then provide an overview of some of the key points to consider when negotiating turnover rent clauses. And finally, I'll provide some observations on the future wider use of turnover rent clauses in retail leases. Well, first of all, in order to understand the discussion around turnover rents, we first have to consider where we've been. And in British retail leases, this has been characterized in the main, in the approach to rent setting, by upward only open market rents at fixed intervals during the contractual term. For landlords, that provides income security and strong headline rents for valuation purposes. But of course, for tenants, leases signed in more favourable times can result in changes in market conditions on an upward-only basis, resulting in significant pressure for those retailers. So turnover rents are cited as a more flexible model, encouraging the parties to share in the gain and the pain, where the rent the tenant pays flexes to take account of market conditions. But of course, turnover rents are nothing new. In fact, Lakeside has been operating a turnover model since it opened in 1990. Vista Village and Bluewater are other well-known examples operating a turnover model. In fact, turnover rents are common in airports, railway stations, shopping centres, where the landlord controls the common parts. But there's been a new spotlight on turnover rents lately during the pandemic, and this is emphasised by the New Look CVA, which was backed by its creditors in September, which saw over 400 of New Look stores switch to turnover rents. Turnover rents also underpinned the All Saints CVA, which was signed a couple of months before that. And we are seeing a trend in retail leases to be offering a more flexible, shorter options. Hammerson, Legal and General recently announced the introduction of more flexible leasing models. So that provides a bit of an indication of the market in which the discussion around turnover rents is taking place. So when it comes to turnover rents, there are various models, different structures that can be applied in retail leases. However, the starting point is always the same, and that's to identify the percentage of the tenant's turnover that will be taken into account in the calculation of the turnover rent. So for fashion retailers, turnover rents of say between 10 to 15% of turnover are not uncommon. In other sectors where the business may have a higher turnover but a lower margin, such as say supermarkets, turnover percentage of between 3 and 5% may be more common. So the turnover percentage very much varies depending on the nature of the tenant's business and the sector in which it operates. So in terms of the classic turnover rent structure, this typically takes the form of a fixed base rent that the tenant pays in a similar way to an open market rent, perhaps on a monthly or quarterly basis. That element is usually discounted from the open market rent, typically 75–80% of the open market value, with the remainder of the rent comprising the top-up element to the extent it exceeds the base rent. So it's variable by reference to the tenant's turnover. So if 10% of the tenant's turnover, say, exceeds the base rent, then the difference will be added as rent. Of course, that's not the only model available. There are models where the tenant pays a pure turnover rent, where the entirety of the rent is based on its turnover, but with a guaranteed minimum amount of turnover. And this is a very crucial point. It's the balance between the certainty of the landlord's income and the turnover element that flexes to take account of market conditions, which is absolutely fundamental. It's that balance between the certain and flexible elements that is key. So once we've settled the turnover percentage, we get into the terms of the turnover rent clause. And fundamental to that is the definition of gross turnover. It's intended to catch all items of revenue at the premises, not just cash through the till. Click and collect sales, where the customer buys the product online, collects in store, those sales will generally be taken into account in the turnover rent calculation. But, and I think this is a significant point in the context of turnover rents, what about where the customer goes into the store, may try the item on, test out the item, and then orders online? Many stores are used for showrooming in particular, and businesses have large online sales. So I think this is going to be an issue going forward in terms of how we quantify the value of the store in a multi-channel world, and how landlords are able to share in some of those online sales in the turnover rent calculation. Other issues that can arise in the context of the definition of gross turnover, landlords will want to ensure that the turnover element is by reference to income receivable, not income received. Landlords want to ensure that they do not lose turnover because of the tenant's bad debts or installment arrangements agreed with customers. For tenants, they want to ensure that any delivery or postal charges that are taken into account in the turnover calculation are limited to the profit element only and not the actual cost of providing those services. So that's some of the issues that can arise in terms of the definition of gross turnover. Other key issues around the negotiation of turnover rents. Landlords and tenants will want to look forward, thinking about what will happen on any assignment or subletting. As I mentioned earlier, the turnover percentage will very much have been agreed by reference to the specific nature of the tenant's business. So if the tenant is looking to assign their lease at a later date, the parties need to consider if the turnover arrangements are to continue, or if the rent machinery will switch back to an open market rent. Also, on any subletting, landlords will want to ensure that any rent derived from those subleases is taken into account in the turnover rent calculation. Common in turnover rent clauses is a keep open covenant. Landlords will want to ensure that the tenant is maximising turnover, remaining open. So there'll be contractual obligations on the tenant to remain open, with a notional rent to apply in the event the tenant breaches that keep open covenant. This has been quite topical in the context of the pandemic, with the forced closure of non-essential retail. Many tenants advisors are now seeking specific carve-outs so that any forced closure as a result of the pandemic is not a breach of these keep open covenants. I mentioned other safeguards the landlord may wish to include in the turnover rent clause. Again, if the tenant's business performs better than expected, the landlord may want to include a success payment that's triggered by the tenant's turnover reaching a certain threshold. On the other side of the coin, if the tenant's business doesn't perform as well as expected, the landlord might want to build in some safeguards by way of a break option exercisable to replace the tenant with a better prospect. Of course, markets change, and it's not uncommon to see ratchet provisions in the turnover rent clause, where the base rent or the turnover element ratchet upwards at certain increments to take account of changes in RPI, or in relation to the turnover rent element, the historic trading performance of the tenant. Now, absolutely fundamental to the operation of turnover rent clauses is the accounting machinery. So the tenant will be required to provide the landlord with turnover data, on which the landlord will use that data to come up with the turnover calculation and calculate the turnover rent payable. So turnover rent clauses very much depend on the relationship of trust and provision of data between landlord and tenant. Landlords will also want the ability to inspect the tenant's turnover records to ensure that those accounts and the turnover information that the tenant is providing is accurate. Another key element is confidentiality. Tenants will often insist on an undertaking from landlords that they only use the financial information disclosed for the purposes of calculating the turnover rent and for no other purpose. Equally, if the lease is required to be registered at land registry, the parties may require the lease to be redacted so that commercially sensitive information is not included. So confidentiality and data sharing, very much key provisions in the turnover rent clause. So what is the future of turnover rents? Well, I mentioned earlier on that turnover rents are by their nature uncertain, and that creates issues in terms of the valuation of property, the landlord's assets, and for funding purposes. So I think going forward, that's going to be one of the issues in terms of how landlords, their investors and funders get comfortable with these turnover rent models. On the other hand, as we see in the changing multi-channel retail world, tenants are insisting on a more flexible leasing model that more readily adapts to changes in market conditions. I touched on the administration of data. So many shopping centres have sophisticated systems for extracting turnover data and providing that information to landlords. But contrast that with the individual retail unit on the high street and how easily it will be to adopt a turnover model in that context. So much really depends on the turnover data, the financial accounting machinery, and how that can be rolled out more widely. I think that's going to be a key issue going forward. On the other hand, many see turnover rent structures as providing a more mutually aligned symbiotic relationship between landlords and tenants, where both share in the pain and the gain. So I hear anecdotally that among retailers, landlords operating turnover models see benefits in terms of being able to identify blind spots in shopping centres, so certain parts of the centre that might not be performing so well, where turnover rents are not so high, can encourage landlords to make changes to their offering in conjunction with tenants. Finally, there's been a lot of talk about experiential retail and tenant investment. If the trend is towards shorter, more flexible leases, query the extent to which tenants will be encouraged or minded to incur large initial fit-out costs. So there's going to have to be some, I think, balance between the income security and flexibility that I touched on earlier in the webinar. For now, turnover rents make up only around 7–8% of rents utilised in retail leases. It's certainly a growing area, but hopefully in this webinar, I've provided an overview of some of the key issues which are going to be relevant to the wider rollout of turnover rents going forward. So I'll hand back to Steve at that point.
Thank you very much for that, Scott. Now, Scott, we have had some questions raised by our guests this afternoon. One which I think even I know the answer to, and I'm a commercial lawyer, not a real estate lawyer. We've been talking about turnover rents in retail leases, but one of our viewers has asked whether we are going to see a reform of the Landlord Tenant Act come out of this commercial change so far as retail leases are concerned. Thoughts?
Certainly, yeah, it's a really interesting question. There's been much speculation about reform of the Landlord Tenant Act 1954, which for the audiences provides security of tenure to business tenants. In the context of turnover rents, yes, very interesting, because we can ask the question, often under the 54 Act, there is provision for the court to determine the rent payable under a new lease. Query with a turnover rent structure how the court will approach the calculation of the new rent under the lease with a turnover rent structure. But yeah, there's lots of speculation around reform of the 54 Act, switching it from an opt-in rather than opt-out, and other reforms. So I think it's a case of watch this space, but certainly in the context of turnover rents, they do raise, I think, particular challenges under the 54 Act.
And do you, just as a supplementary to that, Scott, do you think that the Act, as it stands at the moment, has sufficient flex in it to allow those issues to be addressed, perhaps in a somewhat clunky way? But does the Act have it, or is there going to be a problem?
I think certainly that there is case law that indicates that the courts have shown an ability to look at turnover rents and make the calculation. They have that discretion. So you know, there does seem to be an element of flexibility there. But going forward, I think it really is a case of watch this space, because turnover rents in the context of the 54 Act still, I think, you know, relatively new, and we will see what happens, I think.
And I would hazard a guess that the people who drafted the original 54 Act did not even have a glint in their eye about turnover rents, but there you are, time passes.
Quite.
Following on from that, another of our viewers has asked, coming out of the pandemic, or planning to come out of the pandemic that we're in at the moment, what do you think are the starting thresholds for collaborative rent negotiations with landlords, or is it a case of every situation is the subject to its own length as the piece of string in someone's pocket?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly in the context of the pandemic, we've seen the Coronavirus Act and restrictions on landlords' remedies in relation to rent arrears, which has accrued during the pandemic. So certainly coming out of the pandemic, there'll need to be a lot of open discussions, I imagine, regarding how to deal with rent arrears, which has accrued. I think also much depends on landlords and tenants being open and transparent in providing the information that the parties need to consider, you know, the tenant's financial position and the extent to which that can be accommodated and what the options are. So I think much will depend on information sharing at an early stage.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We've had this discussion having regard to what is happening here in the UK. Does this approach to turnover rents in British retail, have we seen echoes of it, or are we in a situation where perhaps the UK scene is running to catch up with what is happening in other countries? For example, if we talk about the United States, where there have been various stories come out over the course of the last 8 months or so about how the pandemic is affecting retail in the United States.
That's absolutely right. Certainly in the US, turnover or percentage rents, as they're referred to, have been a fixture for many years in their lease models. Certainly in shopping centres and outlets. In mainland Europe, turnover rents are, in certain parts of mainland Europe, turnover rents are becoming more and more common. So I think there is certainly an element of the British retail catching up with other parts of the world. But it's also worth mentioning that some refer to turnover rents, but there's also a discussion around the profit margin of tenants and alternative models around rent calculated by reference to profit margin. So certainly lots of discussion around different flexible leasing models.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fine. Thanks for that. Given where we are, given that you've just indicated that the UK retail scene is running to catch up, do you think there are any barriers to the wider adoption of turnover-based rents in retail leases?
Yeah, absolutely. I think two of the key barriers are going to be around funding models and landlords, funders getting comfortable with turnover rent models. So I mentioned upward only open market rent reviews and the certainty of income stream that provides. With turnover rents, an element of that is lost. So query what additional security landlords, investors and funders may require to make these turnover rent model structures work. So I think that's going to be a big element in terms of landlords, funders getting comfortable with turnover rent structures. Secondly, I mentioned the quality of the data and the accounting machinery, and I think much depends on the provision for the tenant to hold that data around turnover and how that information is provided to the landlord, and the safety measures for landlords and tenants around the provision of that data. So I think much depends on the accounting data, and perhaps some way to go in that regard too.
So are we talking there, Scott, when you say about how the data is held, how it's protected, are we talking there about, as I might call them, robust non-disclosure agreements, or are we talking about something else?
Yeah, absolutely. The confidentiality provisions are crucial in terms of how the landlord uses that turnover data. Absolutely, but more widely, certain shopping centres, I mentioned they have the point of sale data, so the information goes straight from the till to the landlord. Some very sophisticated models. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry to cut across you. So are we talking there about an adaptation of the footfall model, which has been used in certain situations, to the spend model?
Yes, certainly. I think as technology advances as well, we could see more and more systems adopted that are very specific and take account of footfall and other factors, and really what's going on the ground in shopping centres. So certainly, I think as technology develops, we'll see more interesting models coming forward.
Okay. Now, as a commercial lawyer, it seems to me that if funders and investors have still to come to terms, to get comfortable with the turnover model approach. That if we're then moving forward from that and talking about alternatives to turnover-based rents, which you've mentioned, for example, the profitability of a brand, that is something further that investors, that funders will have to get to terms with, or take a view that they're going to exit this particular market.
Certainly, as I mentioned, turnover rents by their nature introduce that element of uncertainty. So it's consideration of what additional items of security or guarantees can be provided to provide that element of certainty. I mentioned base rents and the relationship between the base certain element of the rent and the turnover element. I think that's going to be crucial in terms of how these arrangements work going forward and minimum guaranteed rent amounts. So much depends, and I think this is a constant theme throughout this webinar. It's the balance between certainty and flexibility, which I think is at the heart of the discussion around turnover rents. Okay,
so just time for a couple more questions, if I may. We've seen now this trend, and the title to this webinar asks, is it a trend or is it here to stay? And I certainly know what my mind is telling me, that it is a here to stay. To my mind also, this trend or this here to stay has developed as a result of there being a significant mismatch between supply of retail space and demand. Could you see it, and this is, I suppose, a tangential point, but nevertheless one I think that is worth exploring, could you see it come to impact other sectors of real estate? For example, offices. You're working from home at the moment. I happen to be in our office, but tomorrow I'm going to be working from home. And there has been talk about a reduction in office space going forwards. So can you see the same trend applying to other sectors of retail? Other sectors of real estate?
Absolutely, yeah. You touched on it there in terms of changing habits, changing approach. We've seen it in retail with the rise in multi-channel retail, the move towards online. We're seeing changes in the way people work with a rise in remote working during the pandemic. So as society changes, as the habits change, absolutely I can see more flexible options coming to the fore in different sectors and different asset classes to reflect the changing demand. Absolutely, but I think there are specific issues and considerations which are germane to, say, the office class or hotel and leisure, as opposed to retail. So I think there may be certain variances depending on the sector, but overall that change in habits will no doubt need to be met with changes in the way that leases are modelled.
Okay, thank you. Last question then, before we wrap up. The real estate team here at Fox Williams, what's been their experience to date in dealing with turnover rent retail leases? Has it been an enjoyable experience for the team, or is it something that leaves them cold?
Well, certainly it's an evolving area, and that's important to say. So, especially during the pandemic, with the various pressures on retail tenants, I mentioned in the webinar the various different models that can be adopted, and there's lots of negotiation around the key terms. So we talked about the definition of gross turnover, how the model operates, the base rent, the turnover rent, the financial information and turnover data the tenants provide to the landlord, how often they provide that information, and what should happen if the tenant doesn't provide that information. So lots of considerations around the way these turnover rent clauses operate, lots of different models. So I think our experience has been good in terms of understanding the different variances between these clauses and getting stuck in, and certainly an evolving area. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out going forward as we come out of the pandemic.
Indeed. Scott, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to everyone for joining this webinar this afternoon. Coming up on your screen in a moment is an evaluation form. We would really appreciate it if you could just take a moment or two to complete the evaluation form, telling us what you enjoyed, perhaps what you didn't enjoy this afternoon, and your thoughts for further webinar topics from our Fashion Law Group. But until we see you again, further information at www.fashionlaw.co.uk and also the Fashion Law page on the Fox Williams website. But until we see you again, thank you very much for joining, and thank you, Scott, for a very entertaining and in some respects a bit of a scary webinar this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.